All right, honey, we'll be back in a week. Take good care of the house and don't forget to feed the cat. Yes, Mom, I know. I gave her a kiss and hugged my dad as they grabbed their bags and walked towards the security line. Have a safe flight, I called out as they disappeared around the corner. My parents like to take trips. Costa Rica, Australia, Mexico, anywhere you could think of, they've been there. This time, they were off to Rio to celebrate Carnival. I walked back through the airport towards the parkade. I wrapped my scarf around my face to block the cold February air as I crossed the road and climbed the stairs to the 3rd level. After cranking the heat in my dad's Jeep, I glanced at the clock. 3:24. Why did flights have to leave so early? I pulled out of the parkade and headed towards home. The streets were almost empty, the city still asleep as a thin layer of snow coated the ground. I used to hate these trips. My parents would leave my brother Rob and I with whatever relative they could find and take off, sometimes for weeks at a time. I remember spending an entire month at my grandparents' house when I was 8, while my parents were taking their 2nd European tour. When Rob turned 16, they trusted him to watch the house, so I was able to stay home. Sometimes they would leave us a little extra spending money, and Rob would take me on brother weekends. We did these less and less as I got older, but sometimes we still go to a movie or something. They leave us enough money to get whatever we need, but other than that, they didn't really care what else we did, as long as the house was still standing when they got back. As I pulled into the driveway and parked in the garage, I made a mental note to remember to bring up the garbage bins after the trash had been picked up. Inside, I was greeted by 2 high-pitched noises, the alarm system and my cat. Both wanted my attention. I punched in the code and began taking off my jacket. Petunia let out a soft meow as she wove between my ankles. I gave her a scratch behind the ears and headed to the kitchen to give her a little bit of food. Once she was happily eating, I walked over to the living room and dropped onto the couch. I looked up at the clock on the wall. 4:12. Well, there was no way I was going back to bed now. And I didn't want to go up to my room to play video games, because Rob was probably still asleep. Knowing that I had nothing to do today, I decided I might as well get comfortable. As I made the climb up to my room to change, I wondered what I was going to do with my free time. I knew that Rob tended to sleep until noon on days he didn't have to work, and I knew he would be pissed if I woke him up. I swapped my jeans for my old sweatpants and put on my favorite shirt. It was an oversized souvenir t-shirt from one of those brothers' weekends, when Rob had taken me to the Science Museum. Back in the living room, I turned on the fireplace, grabbed a blanket, and curled up on the couch with my phone. I woke up to a buzzing sound. Confused, I reached for my phone. I knew I had remembered to shut off my alarm, so who would be calling me? I pressed the home button and temporarily blinded myself. Once I could finally see again, I checked my call history. 0 missed calls. I frowned. Then I realized I could still hear the buzzing. I sat up and scratched my head, stumbled into the kitchen and looked at the oven. 5:02. I turned towards the sound of the buzzing, and my eyes landed on the intercom system. I never really knew why the original owners had installed this thing. Sure, it had its advantages. The doorbell was patched into it so you knew someone was at the door from every room in the house. It had a built-in radio that you could broadcast onto every floor. That's how my mom used to wake us up for school, by turning on the radio at 7 sharp. You could also presumably use it to talk to people in other rooms, but we had never used it for that. Sometimes people would accidentally press one of those buttons and anyone could hear everything that the person was doing. That's how my dad found out about Susan's first boyfriend. All the work he had done scaling the house to her window to sneak in, and the idiot had gotten caught by leaning against a button. I put my ear up to the speaker grate. Sure enough, this was where the buzzing was coming from. This was the main control unit, and had all the fancy knobs, buttons, and sliders. There were a bunch of simpler units scattered throughout the house. 1 in each bedroom, 1 in my dad's office, and 3 in the basement. I slid the volume slider all the way to the left and the buzzing sound stopped. Stupid thing must be on the fritz. The house was old after all, and even though the system was only about 20 years old, the wiring in the house certainly wasn't. I decided to make myself some coffee. I grabbed a pod and popped it into the top of the machine. It started up with the familiar sound of the water heating up, and I walked over to the pantry to find something to eat. Pulling a box of cereal from the shelf, I stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I felt an overwhelming sense of unease wash over me. I waited, but I didn't hear any sounds. I convinced myself that it was all in my head and walked back into the kitchen. I poured myself a bowl of cereal and grabbed my mug. Back on the couch, I was browsing the front page of Reddit when the buzzing started again. My head shot up and I looked at the unit on the wall. I walked up to it, but as I got closer, I realized it was coming from another room. I walked back through the living room and into my dad's office. The buzzing was coming from the speaker, and it was even louder than before. I reached for the volume dial and tried to turn it down, but it was already all the way down. I frowned. Of course the system would break when I'm in charge of the house. The feeling of unease began to wash over me again, and I had to remind myself that it was just faulty wiring. On a whim, I decided to turn the volume dial up. The buzzing increased slightly, and I heard the buzzing change just a bit. I turned the dial a little more. My ear pressed right against the box. The volume increased, and I could swear I heard a muffled voice. It sounded like a man speaking. I couldn't make out any words, but I figured the radio must be bleeding through somehow. I turned the volume back down and returned to the main unit. The radio power button was off, so I slid the volume back up a bit and pushed the power button. Soft pop music began to play. It certainly hadn't been music I heard. So maybe it was coming from an AM station. I flipped the switch and the music cut out and was replaced by static. I pressed the button again and the sound ceased. Except the buzzing was back, and louder than ever. This time, I could tell that I was definitely hearing someone speaking. I still couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a man's voice. I leaned over and pressed my ear to the speaker. Just as I thought I was able to make out some of the words, the sound cut out completely. I stood up straight and listened. Silence. Then it started again, this time echoing up from the basement stairs. I felt for my phone and was relieved to find it still in my pocket. I slowly walked to the door and opened it. Looking down into the darkness, I could hear the sound of the voice coming through the buzzing, but I still couldn't understand a word. As I flicked on the light, I felt every fiber of my being tell me not to go downstairs. I'd always hated the basement. Whenever I was down there, I would always get the feeling that I wasn't alone. And it would get worse until I usually ended up running up the stairs. Against my better judgment, I started the descent. At the bottom of the stairs, I turned left and headed towards the guest bedroom, turning on every light as I went. The bedroom speaker was fine, so I went back into the hall and walked over to the workshop door. Sure enough, the buzzing was blasting out of the darkness. I felt along the wall until I found the switch, but nothing happened. I flicked it on and off a few times and let out an exasperated sigh. Pulling out my phone, I pushed the home button and the screen lit up. It wasn't much light, but it was something. I walked into the room towards the tool bench. I could still hear the man talking, but I couldn't understand a word. It was almost like hearing conversation through a thick wall. The room went dark as my phone went to sleep. I pushed the button again and the small area of light returned. As I passed the water heater, I stepped in a puddle of warm water on the floor. I paused. I thought we had fixed the leak in the pipes. I turned to look at the floor when the buzzing got even louder. I continued over to the speaker and turned the volume dial. Nothing changed. I turned it both ways, but the buzzing stayed at the same level. I leaned in closer to try to make out anything at all that would tell me what was going on. If I could just make out what this guy was saying, maybe I would be able to figure it out. Was it some sort of interference from another radio? I knew Mr. Talbot next door was a ham radio hobbyist. Maybe the system was picking up an early morning chat. Just when I thought I could almost make something out, my phone shut off, as did the power to the entire house. I froze. Silence. No buzzing. No hum of electricity. Nothing. I pressed the button on my phone. Nothing. Fighting off terror, I tried to stop myself from panicking. I started to make my way towards where I knew the door was.
Hello?
Every muscle in my body locked up. My mind was screaming at my legs to run, but they wouldn't budge. I don't know how long I was standing there, the warm water reaching the spot where I was still.
Hello, Marcus.
I tried to run, but I slipped on the water and fell onto the concrete floor. I heard my phone hit the ground with a loud crack. I managed to grab it and shove it into my pocket as I picked myself up and ran for the door. Once I was in the hallway, I could just make out that the door to the guest room was open. Hadn't I closed it? I took off towards the stairs, barely able to see.
What's wrong, Marcus?
The voice buzzed from the bedroom as I ran past. I turned the corner and scrambled up the stairs, running through the kitchen towards the front door.
Where are you going?
I crashed into one of the kitchen stairs and tumbled onto the ground. Without missing a beat, I leapt back to my feet and bolted towards the front door. Right as I rounded the corner to the foyer, a high-pitched screech boomed out from every speaker in the house. I threw my hands over my ears as I stumbled onto my knees. The sound was deafening.
Don't go, Marcus. We're going to have so much fun.
The voice was coming from all over the house. I managed to stagger to my feet and grab my keys from the dish at the back door. I threw the door open and stumbled out into the snow. I hit the unlock button and climbed behind the wheel, starting the car and threw it into reverse. I felt the impact as I sent one of the garbage bins flying onto the road, but I didn't care. I turned the wheel, put the car in drive, and took off. I pulled into the parking lot of the gas station at the edge of the community, trying to calm myself down. The store was empty, but the floodlights were still on. I parked the car and closed my eyes, trying to take deep breaths. After several minutes, I reached down and pulled out my phone. I knew it was probably completely broken, but I had to at least check. To my surprise, it lit up. The screen had a huge series of cracks radiating from one corner, but it seemed to be working all right. There was one missed call from Rob. My stomach dropped. Shit! I had completely forgotten about him. Before I could do anything, my phone buzzed and a notification popped up. One new voicemail. I swiped the screen and put the phone up to my ear.
Did you forget something, Marcus?
I screamed and threw my phone. It landed on the floor at my feet. I could hear a loud laughter coming from the other end. I reached down to pick it up. I needed it to stop. As I bent down, I froze. From the light on the screen, I could see my still bare feet. They were still wet, coated in a thick layer of bright crimson blood.